solutions. And one of the first solutions I was selling was VPN protection. So this was back in the day where VPNs were brand new. IPsec wasn't even a standard yet. So I do have a lot of histories. And from that VPNs, I went into personal firewalls on the endpoint security. Then I went into some firewalls. And some of the vendors I've worked with would be things like WatchGuard, Checkpoint, Zone Labs, etc. But about 2 decades ago, I moved over and started working with InfoExpress. So InfoExpress has been selling NAC for 2 decades itself. I myself, I'm based in Singapore. I have been here for close to 25 years is where I'm based. And so I do have a wealth of experience, especially in the NAC field, because I've been focused on this area, as has the company, for over 2 decades. So let me give you a little bit of background on the company InfoExpress. We basically, as I mentioned, been selling NAC for over 2 decades. It's the only solution that we actually sell. So we're really 100% focused on making sure we have the best NAC capabilities out there. And to give you a little bit of old history, we first NAC solution was designed for remote access VPNs. That's kind of where I've learned of InfoExpress, is when we started selling VPNs, customers were concerned about security on those VPNs. So we were the first company to have the concept of doing compliance checks, making sure the devices were corporate assets before they were allowed to join the VPN. With COVID, a few years back, this became a very popular technology again, as more and more devices were joining the VPN. But we also were doing NAC for the normal LAN and normal wireless, and we actually have patents for things like doing enforcement at the switch level with things like 802.1x, SNMP. So we do have a long amount of history with different types of enforcement technologies. But what we learned is most customers really struggle with getting NAC deployed. NAC almost became a 4-letter word. This became so hard to deploy. As a company that's focused on NAC, we really wanted to make things simple. So we basically created the EasyNAC version. It's been our 3rd generation NAC solution. It's been out for about 5 years already. And what makes it simple is customers don't have to worry about deploying agents. That's a nice thing to have, but what really makes it simple is that there's no network changes required. So even if you have an old network with unmanaged switches, you could just put us on your network and we'll be able to work. We'll talk about how that kind of works a bit later in the presentation. But despite that ease of use, we basically provide very strong security features, and we're going into more details on that too. So not only is it easy to deploy, but also offers stronger security. Just to touch base on one of the things, you see a lot of big names on this list, but you don't have to be a big customer to deploy EasyNAC. It's actually very straightforward and simple. But these are names you probably recognize in India. Some of our customers would be Parley, the maker of those biscuits, SIS, the physical security, ATM type security type companies. So those are some of the brand names you'd probably recommend. And there's a lot of small companies also who have deployed our EasyNAC solution.
Jonathan, just wanted to something. So you have seen the transition in the network security, maybe from its nascent basic days to what it is today, which is extremely complex, diversified, and basically a headache. So if you can share what has been your experience over the tenure, how network has become more complex, and why access control is becoming more and more complex and digital. And if you can just throw some experience which you have on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, when I first got into the space, really the only type of security that customers thought they needed was a firewall to protect their network from the internet, maybe antivirus software for the endpoint, and that was and then basically maybe IPS. Those are kind of like the 3 security solutions. And of course, now today there are hundreds of different solutions, and that's really because no matter what customers do, the hackers are always evolving too. And so there's other ways in which they can bypass or find a way to get past the existing security. And I think that's what makes it so complex, is it's an arms race and it just continues to evolve. I think one of the areas that's quite promising is the concept of zero trust. You know, in the historical days, in fact, let me jump ahead to that slide. You know, in the historical days of the network, you had your firewall, and things outside the firewall were untrusted, and things in the firewall or behind the firewall were trusted. And of course, that could be easily exploited, because a piece of software that got installed on one of those trusted PCs is now inside the protected zone. And that's what kind of the zero trust concept, I think, is really powerful, because it basically acknowledges the fact that you can't trust things that's inside your network. And so what zero trust recommends is always continuously evaluate what's on the inside of your network, and don't necessarily trust them, but continuously evaluate them. And that's one of the things that EasyNAC is really good at. Is it's real simple for a customer to get the enforcement technology working with our solution. And I'll go into more details on that. But once you have this enforcement working, then you really have the abilities to do the continuous device verification, including things like you know, verifying AVs running and XDRs running or whatever you're using. The ability to do least privilege access policies, which would help strengthen your security, because if you have a consultant comes on the network, they should only be able to access what they need to do their job. And then there's also, as we mentioned, lots of security solutions, right? Well, they all have a purpose. Those security solutions, though, often lack automated response. So if your IPS detects something, sure, it can send you an alert, but even better, it can send EasyNAC an alert, and we can take that device off your network quicker than any manual process could. So that's kind of why I think, you know, where NAC is really important today, because it kind of ties all the security solutions together and gives you that visibility of what even needs to be protected on your network. So let me jump back to the slides for a moment, because I want to kind of give you a little product introduction here and kind of help you understand why EasyNAC is not, you know, the typical NAC solution. So one of the things that we allow here is we basically allow you just to put an appliance, could be virtual, could be physical, on your network. You don't have to worry about configuring anything on the switches, no SNMP to configure, no spanning ports to configure. We just need an IP address, that's it. And once we have an IP, we can give real-time visibility as to what devices are on that network, profile in them, so you know which ones are running Windows, Android, etc. But more importantly, we actually can block devices that are not trusted. So if an unknown device shows up on your LAN or your wireless, for example, it'll be detected right away, profiled right away, and blocked right away if it's not a trusted endpoint. And then of course, there's always those compliance controls. So we talked about the continuous, you know, verification of devices. Well, the appliance can do that for your other security solutions too. So the appliance could be making sure endpoint security is running. And if that security is running, okay, we're going to give you full access to that network. If we detect maybe the AV is out of date, we can give it maybe partial access to the network so it can get that AV update. And then there's also things like built-in captive portals to allow devices to register maybe for guest access, where we give them internet only, or consultant access, where they get that least privilege access to talk to the server they're there to work on. And then one other key feature is that automated response feature that we talked about. And as you mentioned, there's lots of security options available today, but most of them lack the capability to block PCs on demand, and that's where we're strong. So if we get an alert that from the firewall that a device is misbehaving, we can read that alert and automatically quarantine that device that's a risk to your network. So that's kind of a little.
Talked about you know, automated response. Many a times, you know, when today at this point in time, maybe we have hundreds or thousands of devices which are connected on the network, and zero trust, you know, Zero trust basically allows or disallows after a regular authentication. But when automated response is there, what I understand is if an IP asset is not behaving as per its predictable behavior, will it automatically get out of the network or quarantined and inform it to the admin, or is it like how does this work a little bit more? It will be helpful because maybe at times it's a new joinee and the things are not working the way predictably which is there. So does it always help, or how does it go forward?
Well, I'll go into more details on the automated response, but high level, it basically receives alerts. So today, for example, if you invest in a network monitoring solution, let's say network defense solution, and it detects maybe traffic that looks like ransomware. Well, it could detect that, but all it can do is maybe send off an alert. If it's running an agent, maybe it can try to stop the PC if it has an agent on there, but sometimes devices don't even have agents. So what that system could do instead is the same alert that is sent to the admin, the appliance can receive that alert. So in other words, the appliance can read the email, see that what the alert is about, and then automatically block that device on the network so that if it did have ransomware, it's not going to be able to spread. And that's really the key benefit of that automated response, is the ability to immediately block a device that's a high risk to the network.
Okay.
I want to share one thing, because what I've just told you sounds almost too good to be true. In fact, if you're a networking person, you're probably thinking, how is it possible to quarantine a PC without configuring anything on your network? And this is an agentless solution too. So how do you do it without agents? How do you do it without configuring the network? And the technique we use is quite clever. It's called ARP enforcement. And basically all we really need is to have the appliance connected to normally a trunk port. And what a trunk port is just an adapter that allows us to have IPs on multiple VLANs. So with that trunk port, the appliance would have an IP on each of the VLANs that you want it to protect. So if you had 50 VLANs, our appliance would have 50 IPs, one on each one of those VLANs. Now, what's special about having an IP, that means that we're in the broadcast domain. So if any new device shows up on that VLAN, the appliance would see it immediately because we're seeing broadcast traffic from all the devices on that subnet. And then the technique that we use to block the device is we just send ARP packets. And what ARP packets does is it intercepts the user's traffic. So we basically tell that rogue device, for example, hey, if you want to talk to the default gateway, send your packets to me, I'm your default gateway. And that's what ARP is. It's a protocol that maps IPs to MAC addresses. So what we're really doing is intercepting his traffic and having it come to our appliance, where we can assign things like ACLs to restrict where they can go. Now, with this ARP enforcement technique, there's lots of benefits. Obviously, the key benefit is you can deploy it very quickly. That's because you don't have to make any changes at the switch level. Even if you have unmanaged switches, because there's no changes to be made, it works with those types of switches too. But the detection's real time. The configuration works the same for the LAN as well as the wireless, so you don't need to have different approaches for different types of networks that you may have. It's out of band, so we're not intercepting all traffic. We only intercept traffic of devices that we don't trust. And it also fails open. And this is kind of counterintuitive. You might think, hey, a security solution shouldn't fail open. But this is different because our security solution is protecting your network. And there are other NAC solutions out there that fail close. And what that means is if the NAC appliance goes down, no one can use the network. So you may have thousands of are suddenly unproductive. And no company really wants that. So the fail open concept means, hey, if the box goes down, there's never any changes made to the network anyways. So the network continues to work normally. And of course, there's HA as an option, but worst case scenario, the NAC solution that you bought to protect your network doesn't cause your network to go down. So it's a kind of important design principle. So any
I had, sorry, interrupt. So how, so how do you decide that a device on the LAN is raw or it is not behaving the way it should behave? How do you get to know about it, or how does it?
That's a very good. Yeah, that's a very good point, because we are agentless by design, right? So you might wonder, how do we know a rogue from a trusted device? And the way we do that, let me just jump ahead a little bit, is we basically configure the appliance to talk to your other solutions that you deploy. So it's quite common for companies to use Active Directory for their user authentication. So the appliance can talk to that AD server, learn what devices are domain joined, so we know what devices to trust from the AV's point of view. And then we also could talk to different endpoint protection platforms. So if you're running something like CrowdStrike, we'll talk up to the CrowdStrike cloud and get a list of devices that are running the CrowdStrike sensor, whether or not that sensor is up to date, whether that sensor is currently communicating with the sensor, what the zero trust score, things like that could be pulled down on a regular basis. And those are the devices that we trust. And the same thing works with like patch management servers. So from the patch management server's point of view, have these devices been updated recently? So let me explain this just a little bit better. Is this appliance, we're just regularly pull all the data from these servers, and then we're just tag those devices. So if we detect that, hey, the AV is out of date, we tag it as such. And then devices that have maybe AV out of date tags get restricted. Devices that don't have that tag but have AV managed, they get full access, for example. And so that kind of integration is kind of critical for the agentless based approach. And I'm sharing with you now all the different solutions that we integrate with. And these integrations are included in the system. So we try to support all the major brands for endpoint security. So, if you look at that list, you should see a pretty solid list of companies there.
Yeah. So fundamentally, what it does is, rather than keeping a truckload of signatures and information onto itself, it shares the information which are there on the multiple products which are in use, say a security or a firewall solutions, and then based on that we can configure the policies on the configuration box, and that will help us define that a device is a rogue or a friendly device, which will eventually help us quarantine or allow.
You're absolutely correct. So basically, we just query your existing servers to find out what devices we can trust and maybe which ones are out of compliance. So that's kind of one step to it. But it's also possible for a device to be managed and compliant, but also misbehaving. So that's where we have other security capabilities too. And let me just talk about one of those for a second here. So for example, this appliance, it has an IP on the network. And so it's listening to broadcast traffic, and it's doing that by default, so we know what devices are there. And we can also then monitor what users are doing here. So for example, this particular feature is designed to prevent the spread of malware. And so normally on a given network, you expect a laptop to communicate to its default gateway, of course. And you probably expect a laptop to talk to a printer or something like that. But if all of a sudden we see this device trying to communicate with all the other devices on that subnet, including IPs that no one's even using, well, that's highly suspicious behavior. So we can see that ARP traffic occurring and can immediately quarantine him. And what's really happening is, malware is scanning the network to see where it can spread. We can see that behavior and just immediately block it before that spreading can take place. So that's kind of one of the examples of how we can, not just look at their compliance status, but also their behavior. The architecture a bit more here, because this is kind of critical. all we need to work is an IP address. That's it. You give us one IP on a given subnet and we can protect that subnet. So that's what makes it so simple to deploy. So from an architectural point of view, typically one appliance, could be virtual, could be physical, can be deployed at the HQ, and that'll protect the HQ. Now, if you have hundreds of branches, which is not unusual for like a bank or many organizations, especially in a country as large as India, right? You're going to have lots of branches. So to make it cost effective, you don't have to put an appliance at every branch. All we need is an IP. So your PCs that are already there, they have IPs, we can just borrow it. So we can just install a little software agent there called the sensor. That sensor, you put it on one of the devices and it gives us that layer 2 visibility where we can see new devices joining that branch. It can report what it sees back to the appliance just over HTTPS. And the appliance can basically tell the sensor which machines to trust, and the ones it doesn't trust, it'll do the enforcement on. And so that makes it very cost effective to be able to scale this to hundreds if not thousands of sites. And that sensor, it can be deployed on many different platforms. So if you're using Windows and you have a Windows server, just put it on there. It doesn't have to be a dedicated Windows server, or you can put it on a Linux machine or even a small little Raspberry Pi if you want to sound like an always-on hardware. So that's kind of the architecture behind this. That's all it takes. Even if you had unmanaged switches at this branch, it'll still work fine.
Great. Actually, this I have had some experience in looking at the larger OEMs EasyNAC solution. Trust me, they are not easy. It is extremely not only difficult. We need equipped professionals to roll it out across the headquarter branches, and as and when more and more devices or resources come on board, it starts getting more and more complex, not only in terms of configuration, but also in terms of managing these assets, managing the infrastructure. So yes, it does sound a little too good to be true part. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of raised a very good point there. I mean, Info Express, we've been selling NAC for 2 decades as well. And so we've also had the approach where you configure switches for 802.1x. We configure switches for SNMP based control. Whenever you have to configure a third-party component, there starts becoming lots of dependencies. And that's what makes the other ones difficult. Let me kind of jump to a slide here that kind of will put a high-level comparison of how we would work against these other solutions. So if you look at EasyNAC, it's network agnostic. That means we can work with any type of switches. The first challenge you have with other NAC solutions, radius meaning more 802.1x based approach. SNMP would be more like, you're listening to traffic and then you're basically trying to shut down ports or change ports over SNMP. So these are 2 more traditional approaches to doing it. And just to put some brands next to these techniques. So with radius-based approach, and that would be common with things like Cisco ICE, ClearPass, and other radius-based solutions. SNMP, probably the best known brand for using that approach would be Fortinet or Forescout. They're you try to leverage that approach. So if you're using these 2 approaches, there definitely are switch dependencies. Neither of these approaches are going to work well with unmanaged switches, for example. Even if you had updated switches, there still could be some dependencies. A lot of times you also have to make changes on every switch. So unless you have, the correct, full feature network management tools, you're going to have to push switch changes almost on every switch and sometimes on every port. And these are the kind of configurations you can't do during work hours. So they typically have to be done during downtime, extra hours, weekend type work. So, a lot of challenges to get these deployed. And this kind of process, if you're, an organization of any size, it's not uncommon for it to be a 1 or 2 year project to get NAC fully deployed. But with EasyNAC, because there's no dependencies, For us, it's typically going to be done for a small company within a couple of weeks. If it's a large company, maybe a couple of months. And so that's kind of the real differentiation when it comes to deployment, but that's not where it ends. EasyNAC has a lot of security advantages that these traditional approaches don't have either. We have an IP on every subnet. So that means we have layer 2 visibility. So that gives us greater, because we're closer to the endpoints, we can detect things a lot faster. So for example, rogue device shows up, we see it immediately. If you're using something like SNMP, you may have paid thousands of dollars for this approach, but you're still not going to detect devices that should be blocked right away. There's going to be a delay. And that doesn't make a lot of sense from a security point of view. And then when it does come time to quarantine a device, we offer it very strategic. We offer an ACL-based approach that's kind of provides micro-segmentation, where if you're using 802.1x, you typically have to quarantine, you have to basically configure what's called a quarantine VLAN, where the idea would be, if you come on the network and I don't trust you, I'm going to put you in the quarantine VLAN, where I can put you a compliance check. If you have malware, I'm going to put you in the same quarantine VLAN. So what that means is you're putting devices you don't trust, as well as devices that are high risk, into that same quarantine VLAN, and now you're exposing them to each other, which is not a good design either. You don't put people in prison with mass murderers, and then if they're okay, you take them out. No, I mean, it just doesn't, it's not a very good philosophy. But before I go too deep on that, let me just hit some of the other key capabilities. We have MAC spoofing protection that works very well because we're at layer 2. We have deception features, which are unique to our product, where we can detect hacking activity and quarantine it very quickly. We have the automated response capabilities that can work with anything. So I'll go back and explain how some of these features work. But it's not just about ease of deployment, it's also stronger security that we offer. Let me pause there. Was there some questions that I may have missed?
Yeah, while you were answering, just when you had started answering the question, somebody had put in a note that, what are the value props against competitors? So it was comparative comparison, and it was it was right on time when you were answering.
Okay, great. Well, another question?
One thought I had in mind was, can we double this up as a ZTNA solution? Or should we? Rather, I think, should we do it as a ZTNA solution? That perhaps would be
So, ZTNA is, let me kind of explain a little bit about that. So you have the concept of zero trust. And then zero trust is kind of like one implementation of ZTNA is one implementation of zero trust, really focused on, more remote access. But even if a customer had deployed ZTNA, it's still important to have a NAC solution at their corporate environment. So let's take, for example, you have 1,000 devices at your corporate network. If all of those thousands of devices are using ZTNA and all the resources are in the cloud, you might think you're quite secure, and especially since your ZTNA is doing things like encrypting your traffic and what have you. But if you don't know what's on that subnet, any device can be put on there with an IP, and all you need is an IP to be able to do a man-in-the-middle attack. So a user might think they're authenticating to the ZTNA solution, even with two-factor authentication, but they're really just being taken to a little man-in-the-middle device with stealing those credentials and then making it look like you're connected, but they're connected too. So there's always the need to protect that network to avoid things like that happening. But on top of that also, it could be a simple denial of service. You have some device get on that network, next thing you know, they're giving off fake IPs or stuff like that, and your thousands of users are not going to be productive because their network is not secure and the network keeps going down or having issues. So it's always going to be critical to protect your network where your users are predominantly at. And the solutions can be hand in hand. Now, EasyNAC, as I mentioned, it is a zero trust. It doesn't necessarily control what resources you have access to in the cloud. So ZTNA would be a good fit for that. You know, the focus around EasyNAC is really protecting the corporate networks and maybe controlling what resources you have access to based upon your compliance status or your role on that network. If you're a consultant, certainly restrict their access, things like that.
Understood. Yeah.
Now, that being said, though, you know, a lot of companies today, they have existing VPNs, remote access solutions, and you can certainly use our solution to add ZTNA type functionality to your existing VPN. Because what the VPN does, of course, it encrypts your traffic, so your encryption is already there as part of the VPN. And the way we would work is we're just sit behind that VPN, and our job is to act like a transparent firewall. So what we do is you authenticate to the VPN as you do today, but we're going to block your traffic coming from that VPN unless we trust your device. So how do we trust you? Well, this requires an agent, but if you're running the agent, we can make sure that you're using a corporate machine, the machine is compliant with policies, etc., and then we'll allow your traffic to pass through. And because you're running that agent, we also know who you're logged in as. So we can also assign policy or access rights based upon what AD group you belong to. So if you're a member of sales, you get access to these resources over the VPN. If you're a member of engineering, you get access to these resources. So you can do, you know, most VPNs don't have that kind of role-based control for different types of groups. We can add that onto the customer's existing VPN, so they don't have to make those changes. And of course, it'd be a lot more cost-effective than, you know, buying a whole new ZTNA type solution.
Good.
One of the things I'd like to share with you guys is some of the unique security features that we offer. Because most people, when they think of NAC, they think of authentication, getting on the network, or being blocked, and that's kind of what they think about NAC. But we do offer a lot more security on top of those basic functionalities. We shared with you this malware.ol spread protection feature, but there's some other nice features too. And this is designed, one of the features that we have is a deception feature, kind of a honeypot concept. And it kind of leverages our existing architecture. You know, our architecture, we have an IP on every VLAN. That IP doesn't really do much. It just kind of gives us visibility and allows us to send ARP packets. But we can use that same IP to host fake honeypot services. So we can host, you know, SSH, FTP, Telnet, the kind of services that hackers kind of look for that they may be able to leverage to get information on the network. So we put these fake services on each of our IPs. And these services have no purpose. So if someone makes a connection attempt to that fake service, that is highly suspicious, and we can tag as a honeypot hit, which can have false positives. However, if they then try to log into that fake service with some credentials they may have stolen, well, now we know they're truly trying to hack your network, because there's absolutely no reason to try to log into a fake service that has no data, no value to it. And of course, we can then quarantine that machine, share what activity that user was doing on that honeypot, and, you know, of course, give that information to the management, the SOC team right away, so they can take actions to maybe disable the credentials that had got stolen and stuff like that. So this is a nice little security feature that really helps protect the network from hacking activity. There's another nice feature that I like to share, and this comes back to that automated response capability where we talked about, you know, companies using multiple different solutions for their security. And of course, we wanted customers to leverage that for our enforcement capabilities. So let's say, for example, you're running an AV brand, and that AV detects the endpoint has an issue. So if we detect that issue, I should say if the AV detects that device has malware, it can just send an alert. Now, what makes this special with EasyNAC is that alert doesn't have to be an API call. We do support APIs, but we can work just about with any solution, because if we can read emails. we can read syslogs. So if they can send that alert, we can read it and quarantine that device real time. So I did see a question come up about BYOD.
Yeah.
Let me jump back and kind of discuss how we work with BYOD. So yes, we can support BYOD. It's a standard feature. And by default, if a new device shows up on your network, they're going to get blocked and they're going to be shown a captive portal page. So that happens by default. It doesn't matter if they're on the LAN, it doesn't matter if they're on the wireless, they can be configured to be shown this captive portal page. And then you can set up different registration options. So you can be self-registration, it could be sponsor-approved registration. There's lots of different flexibility on how you want to authorize your users. But I think one of the key benefits here is, once they go through that captive portal and they get authenticated and they get approved, we can limit where they go. So you get that least privilege access policies that are quite popular for Zero Trust. So a guest, even if they're connected to your LAN, we can set it up so they only go to the internet. So their traffic would always flow through our box and make sure that they're only going to the internet. For BYOD type users, meaning maybe an employee with AD credentials, they can maybe register their phone and get access to partial information on the network, whatever you configure for a BYOD role. And where this feature is really powerful is for those BYOD devices that are being brought on by consultants. So you may have different types of consultants, the SAP consultant, maybe email consultant, who knows what type of consultants you have, but they typically would need access to certain resources on your network. So when they join the network, they could be prompted to register. That registration could then be sent as an email to a sponsor. The sponsor can then read that email, approve it, or maybe the sponsor gets a Teams message because we integrate with Microsoft Teams too. So a message could be sent to Microsoft Teams saying, hey, this consultant just registered, they're requesting access to this AD server. You can click the approve button and then that consultant would only have access to the AD server. And so it makes it real simple to be able to do that least privilege access for many different types of consultants. And of course, their traffic's flowing through our box so we can control where they go, how many devices they use. We can check them for compliance too if you want to. So there's a whole suite of capabilities to make the BYOD process more secure. And to be honest with you, there's also companies who say, I don't want any BYOD, in which case it's real simple. You don't even offer the captive portal, you just block any untrusted device.
Yeah, in fact, certain companies I know of, they limit their ERP access to only certain set of devices or certain set of users with only one or two devices. And primarily it happens in manufacturing companies where only limited number of people are allowed, no BYOD, no. The process of approving from home or using a mobile to work, that does not work. Pretty stringent in their workload.
Yeah, I mean, most of the banks, for example, they don't allow BYOD, but there's always going to be exception cases. So even a bank sometimes say, okay, either I provide hardware for my consultants to come on the network, or I put some security in place to control those consultants. So, normally banks wouldn't use these two features, but they certainly would use this feature here. I wanted to just kind of wrap things up and then open up to questions here, because we've covered a lot of good details with you guys. Let me just kind of highlight something and then we'll just open up to any other questions you may have. But the whole idea behind EasyNAC is most companies had struggled to deploy NAC. In fact, customers have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy NAC, and it just becomes an expensive visibility tool, and they don't even get the enforcement working. I would say 100% of our customers, there may be an exception here or two, but really 100% of our customers have enforcement working almost within the first month of their deployment and actually getting value. And that's because there's no changes being required to the network. But On top of that, they do get much stronger security than if they had deployed 802.1x. I didn't mention this earlier, but even if you use 802.1x, that's really just an authentication solution. And so users could still authenticate with personal devices using their AD credentials. So if you deploy 802.1x, you also have to deploy digital certificates to get that trusted device capability. But with our solutions, you don't have that issue. So, we have that ease of deployment, but again, much stronger security because of our layer 2 visibility and some unique features like deception and the MAC spoofing enhancements that we offer with that layer 2 visibility. So, at the bottom line is we're just more cost effective too, because the deployments are going to be fast. You don't have a lot of services that has to be managed, and your skill set could be deployed on other projects.
So, just out of curiosity, traditionally it was a radius approach and an SNMP approach to network access, controlling the network access. How did you find out that you have a better approach towards network access, or why did you do the way your art for technology? Can you just elaborate a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we started off, with the inline approach for VPNs, and that worked fine. And then customers wanted us to start offering compliance checks for their LAN. And so our first approach was using SNMP. And SNMP is a standard for monitoring switches, but it's not a standard for making configuration changes on switches. So using the SNMP based approach, you have to almost engineer the solution for every type of switch that is out there. Every brand, every model has things a little bit differently. So when you're using SNMP, there is a continuous amount of engineering that has to be done to keep the solution working. And so that's one of the big challenges with SNMP based approach is the compatibility and the continuous engineering that has to be done to keep it working. With the 802.1x based approach, this more standardized, but 802.1x wasn't a standard for NAC. 802.1x is a standard for authentication. So authentication with 802.1x works pretty well, but it was never really designed for compliance checking. So you get into the situation where you have bad user experiences. In other words, if you want to do a compliance check before you put them on the network, the only way to do that is to first put them into a quarantine VLAN. So they come on the network, they get put into a quarantine VLAN, which takes time, DHCP requests and everything. And then if they're compliant, you move them over to the production VLAN. So you have to tell the switch, move them, but you also have to tell the endpoint, hey, you're changing IPs. And so you get into that kind of situation where you have to communicate with endpoints, you have to communicate with the switches at the same time and make that transition graceful. And even if you do it right, you still add, a minute delay to the user experience getting on the network. So you have user issues that way. And, just keep in mind, when you do a continuous compliance check and you want to quarantine again, you have to move them back. So sometimes re-architecting your network to support that becomes a real issue. And so that's kind of, I think, why most customers really struggle deploying things like 802.1x, is there's just too many moving parts, too many changes required to make it work well, and the user experience isn't ideal either.
Right. So one very fundamental thing, and which I learned over last few months as well, that the licensing policy which is there, which you have, somebody had put in a question as well, is extremely user friendly. Today the world is moving towards something called subscription and periodic payments and all, but I understand that you also provide perpetual based licensing models as well. So why do you do when the entire ecosystem of such kind of solution is moving towards subscription and stuff?
Well, it's kind of sad to state of the industry. I think a lot of companies are very profit motivated. They want to make sure their revenue streams are very consistent. As a company, we're not your typical Silicon Valley company that's looking to IPO. We've just been consistently growing our business as a independently owned entity. There's no outside investors, so we can just continuously grow our business. And we've always been, keen on trying to find the best solution to the customer. And the best solution isn't always technical. It's also, how do they want to buy? Do they want to buy perpetual license? Do they want subscription? We offer both options, and we give the customer their choice. So it's more of a customer-centric approach. If you want to own it, great. If you want to lease it, that's great too, whichever your preference. But on top of that, I think another thing we've done, which is kind of unheard of, we used to do a concurrent, our licensing model is concurrent, meaning if the device is on the network, it uses a license. There are NAC solutions out there that says, hey, if the device is in the database, it uses a license. So you have a guest that comes on for 1 hour of one day, it's going to use a license for the whole year if you keep track of everything that happened that year. Whereas our solution is going to use a license just for that 1 hour he's on your network. So it's a lot more flexible from that point of view too, in that you don't need as many licenses for EasyNAC as the competitive solutions do.
This has been a really enriching discussion for me, not only because it looks very simple, but also the licensing policy is very user friendly. Along with that, so I have a very limited exposure towards IT infrastructure selling and managing, but NAC has been a difficult solution to this deploy, and we always use a very careful approach towards how to sell, not selling without ensuring that customer is on board with what all features or benefit they want, and then of course after deploying, continuous support which has to be there, which of course adds to the cost which is there. And not only that, it also adds to the attention and the attention which the solution demanded. Now, we have recently worked in the past, and with the ease with which we work was, I'm sure for many people around me, but the ease with which we work was completely different experience. So on that note, I think we have had a very enriching discussion. Let's wait for a few more minutes if some questions pop in here and there. And most of the questions which were there, I think we have addressed them. And,
yeah, you raised a good point there about NAC being difficult. Let me just make a few suggestions for people who are looking at different NAC solutions. Is definitely try before you buy. We as a company, we encourage POCs. They're simple to do with our solution. Again, there's no network changes, right? So we just have to be put on your network, and you can configure policies and test out those policies. A lot of NAC solutions don't even want to do POCs because they know how much trouble they are, and it's going to maybe highlight some of their weaknesses. But if you can't even do a POC, you're taking high risk. So I would recommend, get a demo. Step one, just to get a good feel for what the solution's like. And then if the demo looks good, ask for a POC on your real production network. And then, that would give you the confidence that it's going to work well in your environment.
So, just like, it may not be extremely important with the technology which is there, but a generic approach towards how to derive at a solution, or what do you need in your landscape for network access. Everybody has a very different landscape. A smaller company may have a very complex landscape. A bigger company may have a simpler landscape, or other way, vis-a-vis. Because today's landscape is extremely complex. People are working from home. They have, of course, everybody has at least 2 devices which are on network, and then most of as far as I know, almost all the companies I know have at least one feed on premise as well as on cloud. So it is difficult. Now, when a IT manager or a CISO or a CFO wants to, or an architect wants to design a NAC solution which is suitable to their requirement, how should one approach? Or making it a bit more simpler, where should one begin?
That's a good question. And where you begin, I guess, would be where you see is the biggest risk. Some customers might see their biggest risk being the VPNs got out of control. So during COVID times, for example, that was the biggest risk for a lot of organizations. When it comes time to go back to the office, now it's kind of switched back to the corporate land again. But with EasyNAC in particular, what a customer would do if they say, okay, I want to consider a NAC project, they usually would start with the end user VLANs and say, okay, I'm pretty comfortable with my data center. I know what goes in my data center. It's behind a lock and key. But on the end user VLANs, I don't know what the users are doing. If there's shadow IT being deployed, there may be servers there that aren't being maintained. There may be access points that users are putting in there so they have more, convenient access to the network, wherever the case may be. So usually they would start with the end user VLANs and make sure that those are secure. And then step one is just keeping untrusted devices off the network. And then step two would be, okay, we have compliance requirements. So I want to make sure that this new endpoint security that we deployed is deployed on all the endpoints. I want to make sure patches are being pushed to all the endpoints. So you start putting in those, agentless compliance checks and validating that, yeah, we have compliance, and you can have those reports that you might want to show for ISO certification or any other type of compliance requirements that you may have. Those are usually the two key points to get started with is keeping unknown devices off the network and making sure those compliance is there. And then of course you can add these other value-added security features as as needed.
So I think we are not left with much time, but I'll ask you for one last question, and thanks for obliging. Can you, if you recall any interesting incident or maybe something which you have, some project where you have seen a major achievement or a difference, without naming the customer, something very interesting which will, which will be a learning, if you recall at all, or it's fine.
Nothing comes to the top of my head, which is probably a good thing in a way, because the idea behind NAC is it's more proactive. But I would say one thing that's quite common is when customers deploy us, they always find more devices on the network than they thought they had. So that's probably a very common occurrence, would be they deploy it, and next thing you know, they might say, oh, we have about 500 devices on their networks, and it turns out, no, it's closer to 600 or 700. So it really helps them get visibility as to what they really need to secure. And that's probably the biggest insight that customers can get deploying us right away. But from a security point of view, knock on wood, we haven't had any real incidences where customers were using our security and had an attack. So hopefully that stays the case, but that might just be luck. But yeah, it's hard to say, but a lot of big companies out there, you see, they get prone to having malware attacks as well. So hopefully we never have those kind of circumstances with our customer base.
I'm not going to wood on that. And thank you, Jonathan, for giving us your precious time, explaining it with patience and diligence, and I'm sure we'll be able to do good. Thank you again. Thanks a lot from our guests as well.
My pleasure. Thank you, Himesh, and thank you to WizWorks for putting this on. Wiztech.
Have a lovely day. Have a lovely evening and a nice weekend as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.